I'm on the Village Green in Lexington, Massachusetts. It was here on an April morning more than 2 centuries ago that the American colonists first fought the British, starting their journey to becoming a separate and independent nation. Though it would take another 8 years for the colonies to rid themselves of British rule, the war that started here marked the founding of a new form of government, one based on the consent of the governed rather than the dictates of a king. We, the people, are the opening words of the U.S. Constitution. The United States in 1775 was sparsely populated. It had a population of less than 3 million people. Communication was painfully slow. It took days for a message to go from Boston to Philadelphia by horseback, and weeks for it to go by ship from Boston to Savannah. The United States today stretches from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. It's home to 325 million people. It has 25 metropolitan areas that have populations as large or larger than did the original United States. As for communication, it's instantaneous. How do you govern a country that big, that complex, that connected, that diverse? That's the question we've explored throughout this course, and that we'll recap in this final session. In the first session of the course, we discussed the concept of power, the ability of an actor to influence policy or control the behavior of others. Power is central to politics. Actors with enough power can impose or cut taxes, start or stop wars, you name it. I'm going to use power as a way to review what we've covered in the course. We'll talk about the power that's exercised through rules, institutions, ideas, knowledge, money, and citizens. Let's start with the power of rules. There's an old saying known as the golden rule of politics. Those who make the rules get the gold. Now that's literally and sadly true for some countries. Zimbabwe was once one of Africa's most prosperous countries. Today, Zimbabwe's economy is a wreck. Its wealth has been plundered by a corrupt regime that, after taking power in the early 1980s, rewrote the rules to enrich itself. But the rules are important in every governing system. In the American case, the basic rules were devised by the writers of the Constitution. They sought to limit power, dividing it between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches in order to keep absolute power from falling into the hands of a tyrannical leader or majority. That rule, the separation of powers, sets the United States apart from most democracies. They have parliamentary systems where the majority party has full legislative control. But the American system requires the House, Senate, and President to agree before legislation can be enacted. That rule can make it difficult for the majority to govern, unless, as in the 1960s, one party controls the presidency and has overwhelming superiority in the House and Senate. But when the parties are closely matched, legislative deadlock can result, as we've seen in recent years. On the other hand, America's system of divided and fragmented power is a boon to interest groups. I suggested in one session that the American system is as close to interest group heaven as it gets. Lobbying groups have countless points of access: House members, senators, the White House, the executive agencies, even the federal courts. That's different from a parliamentary system where group access is limited because power is concentrated in the hands of a few top leaders. The difference is a chief reason the United States has far more lobbying groups which wield far more power than do other democracies. The rules also explain why the United States has a two-party system. Most democracies employ proportional representation. Under that rule, parties win seats in proportion to the percentage of votes they receive in an election. It's a system that enables smaller parties to compete for a share of power. In contrast, the United States uses a single-member district system of election, which advantages big parties. A party has to finish first in a district in order to win the seat. A party that repeatedly comes in third or fourth gets nothing, which discourages smaller parties from competing. Now, rules differ in how precise they are. Some are rigidly defined, others are more open-ended, and that can affect how power gets distributed. The case in point is federalism, the division of sovereignty between the national government and the state governments. American federalism is an imprecise rule. As we explained in the federalism session, the U.S. Constitution does not list the powers of the state governments. Instead, the 10th Amendment reserves to the states the powers not held by the federal government. So the issue of state power is a question of the limits of federal power. That arrangement has contributed to the gradual expansion of federal power. The Supreme Court's interpretation of Congress's commerce and taxing and spending powers has enabled the federal government, in response to changing national needs, to reach into areas traditionally controlled by the states. Through federal grants and aid to the states, for example, Washington now has a large say in health, education, and welfare policy. Under the rules of federalism, states can refuse to accept a federal grant, but if they take it, they must abide by the conditions set down by Congress. The point I'm making is this: rules affect the distribution of power. So too do institutional arrangements. Governing institutions are dynamic rather than static. They change as conditions change, and some institutions are structured in a way that makes them more adaptive than others. The presidency is an example. Although the writers of the Constitution expected the president to provide national leadership, its main job was to administer the laws passed by Congress. And that's how most early presidents saw their job. As President James Buchanan said, "My duty is to execute the laws and not my individual opinions." No modern president has looked at the job that way. As America went from a rural society to an urban and industrialized one, the federal government took on additional policy responsibilities. Congress, because of its fragmented structure, was ill-suited to overseeing the executive branch as it expanded to hundreds of agencies and hundreds of thousands of employees. Congress had no choice but to cede most of that oversight to the president. In 1939, for instance, Congress created the Executive Office of the Presidency to help the president oversee the bureaucracy. The EOP today has nearly 2,000 staff members and 11 units, including the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Council of Economic Advisors. Later in this session, I'll give you an example of how the EOP exercises its oversight function. But the staff resources available to the president through the EOP have also enabled the president to engage in a level of policy analysis and planning that's beyond the capacity of Congress, and that's become increasingly important as policy issues have grown in complexity. It's a reason, along with the president's unitary executive authority, that the president has become the source of most major policy initiatives, though on paper that would seem to be the job of Congress. The presidency has also benefited from changes in technology and in America's international role. We live today in a world where security threats can materialize overnight from almost anywhere on the globe, and where the United States has the military power to respond quickly. These developments have shifted power to the presidency. You may recall from an earlier session what Senator William Fulbright, a leading congressional critic of the Vietnam War, said of the presidential office. "It has been circumstance which has given the executive its great predominance. An entire era of crisis in which urgent decisions have been required again and again, decisions of a kind that Congress is ill-equipped to make. The President has the means at his disposal for prompt action. The Congress does not." That development has weakened the Constitution's system of checks and balances. The United States has gone to war scores of times since the end of World War II, usually by sole order of the President, even though Congress has the constitutional power to declare war. Congress, as we noted in one session, has no foolproof way to limit the President's war power. Now, Congress remains a powerful institution. It has the lawmaking authority and the power of the purse, extraordinary powers in any age. And Congress is supremely designed through its committee system to handle scores of issues simultaneously. Early in its history, Congress instituted the committee system and gave committees the power to write legislation, a power that's denied committees in many national legislatures. But relative to the president, the demands of modern government have worked to Congress's disadvantage. Let me provide one more example of how institutional structure can affect an actor's power. The Supreme Court today is a far more powerful institution than the writers of the Constitution envisioned. Now, how did that come about? One reason is that the judiciary is a separate branch. The other two branches have a say over the Supreme Court. The President nominates and the Senate confirms its justices. But once on the court, justices, in effect, serve for life. That places them largely beyond the control of the other branches. Then, too, the Constitution expresses the court's power in general terms. It grants the court the authority to hear all cases arising under the Constitution, federal law, and treaties. That's a broad mandate when one considers that much of the law is imprecise in its wording. The Constitution, for example, grants Congress the power to regulate commerce among the states. But what's meant by the term commerce? The Constitution doesn't say. How does commerce among the states, which Congress is empowered to regulate, differ from commerce within a state, which it is not? The Constitution doesn't say. So who decides the meaning of such words? It's the courts. Furthermore, the Supreme Court, early in its history, when it was housed in the Capitol building, assumed a power that is not explicitly granted it by the Constitution. In Marbury v. Madison, the court struck down an act of Congress and in the process claimed for itself the power of judicial review, the authority to judge whether officials are acting within their constitutional power, and if not, to nullify their action. That's a powerful position to be in. The U.S. system splits power between three branches and between the national and state levels, while also creating a dividing line between the power of government and the rights of individuals. Each boundary is a source of dispute, and the Supreme Court has the final say. As Justice Charles M. Hughes noted, "We are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is." That's a significant power, and it was a basis for my claim in the judiciary session that the Supreme Court is an unusually powerful court. Institutional structures matter, that's clear. So do ideas. Politics is typically portrayed as a game of strategy and ambition, not as a realm where ideas count. But as economist John Maynard Keynes said, ideas are more powerful than is commonly understood. Keynes authored one of those ideas, the theory that government, rather than cutting back on spending during an economic downturn, should spend freely in order to stimulate the economy's recovery. Keynesian theory, first applied during the 1930s Great Depression, prompted scholars and policymakers to reevaluate the government's economic role. That led economist Milton Friedman in the 1950s to devise monetary theory, the idea that the amount of money in circulation can be adjusted to slow down or speed up economic growth. Monetary theory has altered the distribution of power in Washington. It turned the Federal Reserve, the Fed, which was a low-profile institution before it assumed responsibility for monetary policy, into one of Washington's most visible and powerful institutions. No set of ideas, however, has had a greater impact on American politics than those on which the nation was founded: liberty, equality, individualism, self-government. Those ideas were voiced in the Declaration of Independence and became the basis of America's political culture. It's impossible to understand American politics without taking the nation's founding ideas into account. In the first session, we pointed out the difference in how Americans and Europeans look at the issue of helping the needy. Americans are more inclined than Europeans to think that people should take care of themselves, a reflection of their belief in individualism. The difference between Americans and Europeans is reflected in a range of policies, including social welfare. Although the United States has a higher poverty rate than do most European countries, it spends less money on programs for the poor. The rules of welfare eligibility also differ. In most European countries, for example, all citizens are entitled to government-provided health insurance. In the United States, Individuals must prove that they are poor before receiving government help in obtaining insurance. Individualism's impact can be seen in other ways as well, including income policy. Compared with other Western democracies, the United States has lower tax rates, particularly on those of high income. As Yale University's Robert Lane noted, Americans prefer market justice to political justice, meaning that they strongly prefer to have society's benefits distributed through the workplace rather than through government policy. Equality as an idea has also had a marked effect on our politics. America's promise of equality helped fuel the abolitionist movement, the suffrage movement, the black civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and the gay rights movement. Now, these movements didn't succeed solely because they were fueled by a powerful idea. Successful political movements require commitment, leadership, and resources. But a movement also needs legitimacy, which is more easily achieved when its goal is aligned with a powerful and widely held idea. Ideas gain added power when encased in law. If liberty and equality had been expressed only in the words of the Declaration of Independence, they would still have had an impact on the nation's political development. But they gained power when they were encased in constitutional amendments. That has enabled the Supreme Court to issue a series of rulings that have greatly expanded our right to speak freely, to obtain a fair trial, to be treated equally in law, to be protected not just from action by federal authorities, but from action by state and local officials as well. Yet another source of power is knowledge. In several sessions, I claimed that knowledge is power. You may recall the words of Ted Sorensen, a top advisor to President Kennedy. The essence of decision is choice, and to choose, it is first necessary to know. No matter how simple a policy issue may seem, it usually has layers of complexity. Recognition that the United States has a trade deficit with China, for example, can prompt policy change, but it doesn't begin to address basic issues, such as the form the new policy should take and the impact of a policy change on other issues, including national security. So who exercises power through knowledge? Well, as we've seen during the course, lots of actors do, including the President's policy advisors, the expert staff on congressional committees, the lawyers that litigate Justice Department cases, the economists at the Federal Reserve, the policy experts housed in universities and think tanks. The power of knowledge can be illustrated by looking at the budgetary process, the steps the federal government goes through in enacting the annual budget. Each year, all federal agencies, and there are several hundred of them, must have their budgets renewed. The process starts with OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. OMB has the task of issuing guidelines to each agency, including a budget ceiling that it cannot exceed. How does OMB develop these guidelines? Well, the President is a source of guidance. OMB is part of the executive office of the President. But the details? Well, they're largely worked out by OMB's professionals, its economists, policy analysts, management specialists, and budget experts. Now, after OMB has completed its work, the agencies dig in, deciding how to allocate their funding across their various programs and activities. Key decisions are made at this point, and they're driven by bureaucrats' knowledge of their agencies. Whereas the President and members of Congress are policy generalists, bureaucrats are policy specialists. Many of them spend their entire career in the same agency, where they gain a thorough knowledge of its programs. Bureaucrats' knowledge gives them power during the budgetary process. As we indicated in our session on the bureaucracy, bureaucrats have an agency point of view. They are committed to their agency and use their knowledge to shape its budget in ways that protect it. Now, after the agency budgets are complete, they're combined into the executive budget that the President submits to Congress each January. Congress has the final say on the budget, subject to a presidential veto. But members of Congress are not positioned to understand every detail in the budget. Although they acquire expertise through their committee work, the budget is massive, and members of Congress have only so much time and information. So they turn for advice to the very people who worked up the agency's estimates, the bureaucrats. They're called before Congress to testify in budget hearings. Members of Congress also seek advice from the lobbying groups that benefit from agency programs. During our session on interest groups, we noted that lobbyists often have a better understanding of issues than do members of Congress. Lobbyists concentrate on a single issue, while the members must deal with many of them. Now, I'm not suggesting that knowledge alone drives the budgetary process. The President and members of Congress have policy priorities, and they find ways to work them into the budget. But knowledge is a significant source of power in budget negotiations, just as it is in many other policy areas, everything from trade agreements to weapon systems to antitrust action. And if knowledge is power, a lack of it can be disempowering. As political scientist Hugh Hecklow notes, interests with a stake in a policy can be sidelined because they don't know enough about the issue to contribute meaningfully to the policy debate. Many policy issues are of this kind. For example, the American people have a stake in U.S. policy in Africa, but know so little about the continent that their opinions don't carry much weight. Knowledge is power, so is money, and it works primarily to the advantage of business interests. In 1929, political scientist E. Pendleton Herring wrote that of the many organized groups maintaining offices in Washington, there are no interests more fully, more comprehensively, and more efficiently represented than those of American industry. Although the lobbying scene in Washington has changed greatly since 1929, consumer and environmental groups, for example, are now part of it, business firms and trade associations still predominate. They account for roughly 2/3 of all registered lobbying groups. And when it comes to spending, their predominance is even more pronounced. Of the 10 groups that have spent most heavily on lobbying over the past few decades, only one of them, AARP, is not a business lobby. The top spender, the Chamber of Commerce, has spent more than $1 billion on lobbying since the late 90s. Election spending also has a business tilt. One indicator is the number of PACs, political action committees. You'll recall that PACs collect voluntary contributions and then donate them to candidates. Nearly 2/3 of all PACs are associated with corporations or trade associations. These PACs are also the heaviest spender, as you can see in this chart. Of the top 10 spenders in the most recent presidential election cycle, all but one was business related. The exception was the Credit Union Association, which represents the nation's credit unions, which by law are nonprofit institutions. Super PACs tell pretty much the same story. You'll recall that Citizens United, the Supreme Court's 2010 ruling on campaign finance laws, opened the door to unlimited campaign spending by corporations, unions, and independent expenditure groups, provided they do not coordinate their spending with that of their preferred candidate. Super PACs are the outlet for multi-million-dollar contributors. During the last presidential election cycle, the top donor, Sheldon Adelson, who owns several gambling casinos, contributed nearly $100 million. So what does all this money buy? Well, it can give the lucky candidate who receives the money a boost, sometimes enough of a boost to win a close election. And for sure, money buys access, the chance to meet and talk with top policymakers. As one lobbyist said about the importance of his group's campaign contributions, talking to politicians is fine, but with a little money, they hear you better. There's a final source of power to discuss. It's the power of citizens. Much of what I've said so far would suggest that ordinary Americans don't have much power. Some observers believe that to be true. In his 1956 bestseller, The Power Elite, sociologist C. Wright Mills argued that corporate elites effectively dictate the nation's economic policies. That conclusion is backed by a 2014 study conducted by political scientists Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page. They examined nearly 1,800 policy actions, seeking through opinion polls and group activity to determine the pattern of influence. They conclude, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. That's a sobering finding. but it's not the full story. The power of ordinary citizens is less a question of the influence over a particular policy decision than it is a question of influence over the broad direction of government policy, a point we made in several sessions. In one of those sessions, we examined the policy impact of political movements. They hastened the abolition of slavery, the granting of the vote to women, the dismantling of America's two-race system of governing, the assimilation of women into the workplace. Political movements are driven not by wealthy elites or business lobbies, but by ordinary people seeking a fair shake. Some of the largest changes in American society have come about when ordinary citizens have decided they've had enough of politics as usual and take to the streets. In yet another session, we examined public opinion, noting how the direction, intensity, and salience of people's opinions can affect public officials. It's also true that citizens' opinions can keep issues off the table. An example is the Social Security program, which has such broad public support that it's protected from wholesale revision, a lesson that Presidents Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush learned the hard way. The power of people was also apparent in the sessions where we discussed elections and political parties. If there was any doubt about the importance of the vote, it would have been dispelled by the sweeping victory that voters handed Republicans in the 2010 congressional elections. In the 2 years before the 2010 election, Congress enacted several major bills, including the 2009 Economic Stimulus Bill, the 2010 Health Care Reform Bill, and the 2010 Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Bill. After voters handed Republicans a huge victory in 2010, work on such bills stopped, replaced by work on bills aimed at cutting federal programs and spending. The power of the vote was also evident in our discussion of party realignments, those periods when the parties reposition their coalitions and policies. What drives a party realignment? The answer is people. A shift in popular support from the Republican to the Democratic Party during the 1930s Great Depression shaped the next 3 decades of American politics. The New Deal realignment brought with it a host of programs aimed at helping ordinary citizens, including Social Security, the minimum wage, Medicare, and Medicaid. Our session on social issues also highlighted the public's influence. Although economic interests have a large influence on economic policy, it's popular opinion, the opinion of the people, that drives issues like same-sex marriage, abortion, the legalization of marijuana, immigration, and race relations. We noted, for instance, the recent change in Americans' opinions on same-sex marriage, a change that accelerated the legalization of such marriages. A final example of the power of people is constituency influence on Congress. We talked about the inordinate amount of time and attention members of Congress give to the residents of their district or state, the extent to which their congressional staffs are engaged in constituent service, the tendency of members of Congress to deviate from their party when its position on a bill conflicts with that of their constituents. Now, before summarizing this session, our last one, please allow me a brief personal comment. Although ordinary citizens have power in the American system, they don't have the power they deserve. One reason is that, whatever some officials may say, they're not interested in seeing large numbers of citizens go to the polls on Election Day. The United States has a long and ugly history of vote manipulation. Early on, property ownership was a voting requirement. After the Civil War, a whole new set of tricks, including whites-only primaries, were invented to deny Black Americans the vote. Women weren't allowed to vote until the United States was well into its second century. Today, a citizen who wants to vote can face multiple hurdles. Long lines at polling places because officials deliberately placed too few voting machines there. Registration offices that are hard to locate and frequently closed, and the requirement of a government-issued ID as a condition of registration. The Supreme Court has been slow to disallow such practices. As vigilant as the court has been about free speech, it has failed to forcefully protect the right to vote. Yet, we also haven't done our part. Turnout in U.S. elections is far below that of nearly every other democracy, and at times shameful. If citizens are to exercise more power in America, They need to write a new chapter on voting as a right and as a duty. It's possible that a new chapter is being written. In the 2018 midterm election, turnout jumped by 12 percentage points over the previous midterm, reaching its highest level in a half century. Time will tell whether 2018 was a turning point in voters' power. Okay, let's wrap up the session. To recap the course, I've highlighted 6 sources of power. One is rules. For example, how the U.S. system of dividing power allocates power differently than does a parliamentary system, which works to the advantage of interest groups but can weaken the majority's power. A second is institutions. We noted that institutions are dynamic rather than static, with the result that changes in conditions can alter an institution's power. An example is the presidency, which is institutionally better suited to the demands of modern policy making than is Congress. We then discussed the power of ideas, noting that theoretical ideas, such as fiscal and monetary policy, and principled ideas, such as liberty and equality, have more power than is commonly assumed. We then shifted to the power of knowledge, where, through a look at the budgetary process, we pointed out the influence of expert and specialized knowledge on policy. Fifth, we examined the power of money, indicating that business and wealthy interests wield inordinate power through their lobbying and election activities. We closed by looking at the power of citizens, suggesting that their influence is best seen by looking at broad developments, those resulting from political movements, party realignments, and major shifts in election outcomes and public opinion.